I'd like first to, I think it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss Joe's talk. And probably Joe doesn't recognize me, but it's not the first time that we met. We met something about in the mid-'80s. I was a young student at what was not yet PSC. It was like the Delta. And before the Delta, actually, and you were invited by Roger Guenry and François to give some talk. I was a young student doing my master degree, and you were there to explain to us the intricacies of the Rothschild-Stiglitz and Weiss model of credit rationing. And that's probably the time where you were doing your small revolutions about putting information, asymmetric information into economic theory. And I was really much impressed, and that basically changed a little bit my perception about economics, because at the time we were very much trained, as you said, to view economics with a very sort of standard way of framing how to explain economic behavior and individual behavior. And that already triggered my interest into this topic on the social determination of preferences, as you can say. Essentially, what Joe is doing here is to start to say, okay, we have the two main pillars of economic analysis, which are fixed preferences and rationality, and we need to move forward. And already the profession certainly did so with what's called a quasi-rational enculturated actor, and where there are two major differences that need to be taken into account: the importance of social context and the existence of cognitive resources, the cultural mental models. And therefore, to do that, we move forward into the territory of psychology, sociology, anthropology. And actually, we don't move forward. We let us being imprinted by the insights from those other disciplines. And clearly, I mean, as the talk was showing, this is useful for development policies with number of examples coming from lab and field and natural experiments and providing new policy levers. Now, as I said, I mean, I was trained in the mid-'80s as an economist, so I could not think when I was listening to Joe's talk about something like it's quite a long way from where we started in economics. And I had this quote, which might look to you rather sort of bizarre. This is a quote that says, "The low rank of the develops is due to the fact that this caste, in recent times, has not strictly enforced the taboos against association with the polished, sociogs, and other tribes. Other icons look upon this with considerable apprehension as endangering the moral fiber of the tribe, and suspect even that it develops of relinquishing models making." And model is not with a typo. For those of you who are not familiar with this quote comes from a famous paper by a Swedish economist, Alex Lejongius-Food, in a paper called Life Among the Econs, and where, in a very humoristic way, he described with anthropological style how we function as a tribe, the econs. And as you can say, actually things have changed quite a lot. We are not anymore at a taboo, because in this paper, basically it describes the econ profession as being sort of characterized by number of castes. On the top, at the 70s, the caste was the theoretical economist, and then at the bottom, they were development economists. And the development economists was at the bottom because they were starting to mix already with those ugly guys from sociology, psychology, and political science. But now we are sort of going over those prejudices and discrimination, and we are getting, frankly, into these new fields. Now, what I would like to do in my discussion is to basically organize my discussion along three main lines. First, I would like to resituate a little bit all the ground that has been covered by Joe on the quasi-rationally enculturated actor, then go from some remarks and questions that came up when I was sort of going through your slides, and then finally get into another aspect which is related to policy implications, in particular the political economy of the quasi-rational enculturated actor. So to situate a little bit the beginning of the analysis, this is the starting point that everybody knows about, how Homo economicus, and how it is characterized. It's characterized with fixed preferences. They are individually centered. We have rationality and optimization. We basically respond to incentives. And the way we sort of look at this from an empirical perspective, looking at observables, prices, incomes, more generally any proxy for opportunity cost of behavior. So now we question those three dimensions: preferences, whether this is individually centered or maybe interdependent with others, and the rationality assumption. So this is a starting point. Where we go? The first way is to look at sociology, and sociology tells us preferences are endogenous, they are interdependent. The way we think about how they frame our behaviors is internalization or socialization, or what Joe would call exposure to role models. The incentives where the focus would be more on the social context and the social structure of networks in which we are embedded. And probably the way to observe that will be to look at what are the groups, how the groups are structured, what are the influences. Then we have the homo psychologicus. There we have multiple selves and identities, and we have interdependencies, but it's internal, at least for individual psychology. We are fighting with different selves, some are nice, some are not so nice, different identities. We have this sort of dual process of optimizing, fast versus slow thinking, with a bunch of cognitive biases, and we are sort of stimulated by activation, perceptions, and salience, and the way psychologists tend to do that and manipulate this is by having priming and exposure in different contexts. And probably, yes, behavioral economics, the QE actor will be those two columns, right? And then we'll have Karloff and Joe will basically encompass those three columns. And then I put a fourth column that is empty so far, and that was not so much described in your talk, but probably is also a column that may explain individual behavior and human behavior, and which is the homo evolutus. Who is the homo evolutus? Well, why would we stop at sociopsychology, anthropology, and psychology and sociology? Let's go further than that. Biology. After all, we are animals. We are human beings made of bones and flesh. And as you say, birds know how to coordinate when they fly because it's genetically coded. We have also genetic codes. And that's one way to explain individual behavior. Genes, genetics, replication and mutation to explain variation, selection and adaptation, the best fit to the environment, and the tool that biologists tend to look at is environmental changes and population dynamic and structures. And this has been applied as well to economics. Think about evolutionary game theory. There are other domains as well where this is probably more relevant for human beings when we fix our genetic structure, which takes a long time to change, which is culture. And culture there, the analogy will be memes, cultural traits, learning and innovation rather than replication and mutation, selection and adaptation, but social selection, and again, models based on population structure and dynamics. And those are part of what is called the cultural evolutionary dynamics. And in sociobiology and in evolutionary anthropology, the co-evolutionary theory of culture and genetics. Why are we cultural animals? Many other animals actually are also cultural, apes, whales, but we have special features that allow us to be able to design eventually some institutions that create coordination. And this is cumulative culture. And we are uniquely determined by our genetic structure. So this is another way also to think about how to explain individual and social behavior and altruism and all those things, characteristics that has been sort of described here in Joe's talk. By the way, the two main elements of the quasi-rational enculturated agents, they go across those different columns. Social context happens for social networks, for environment and populations, cultural mental models, cross across homo psychologicus, sociologicus, and evolutus in terms of cultural traits. Okay. Now let me get into some remarks and questions that are sort of popping up after Joe's talk. The first thing is that when you look at those different perspectives, you might think, what is the relevant column that is the one I'd like to use to best describe individual behavior and social outcomes? And there, probably what is relevant is the time scale of change of preferences. If we think about explaining something with a very quick time of processes, decision-making just at the moment, probably psychology will be good enough. If we think about longer time of evolution, diffusion and accumulation, maybe then our standard sort of models and eventually some views from sociology will be good enough. And now if we think about even longer periods, over more than 7,000 years, but human beings have existed for more than 7,000 years, maybe evolution and selection might be relevant. Now, the second thing, of course, that comes up immediately after Joe's talk is that, well, we are getting rid of the two pillars of economic analysis that we teach in our first micro course, at least up to very recently. It's not very dangerous, opening the Pandora box. And the reason why it may be dangerous opening the Pandora box is that at the same time, we need to think about another really important element about our profession, identification power. And why can we identify and how we can identify exactly in terms of people, the way people interact, and on which domains actually people interact. So in this sense, to illustrate this reflects basically the three domains in economic analysis that we use to explain individual and social behavior. Preferences, possibility sets, we mean by that technologies, budget constraints, and stuff like this, information sets, beliefs, and information pieces, okay? Generally, in classical economics, standard economics that we teach, we look at interactions of those two different elements. Individuals interact through possibility sets, technologies, or through prices, budget constraints, and markets determine what happens. Or information sets, diffusion of information, learning, and Bayesian, basically, revision of information that we get over before deciding our actions. If we think about Gary Becker's work, social economics, that would be mostly saying, okay, let's look at the other box here. People interact through preferences. Preferences are endogenous, but they're endogenous in a way which looks like a little bit rational. Rather than saying that we have just fixed preferences, we now choose our preferences, and we have a rational way to choose preferences because we have a sort of upper level preference level, a meta preference. And that helps us explain a number of things in terms of changes in preferences, particularly rational addiction and drug consumption, for instance, or smoking, or eventually teeth brushing. Now, when we think about economic psychology, then our preferences here tend to interact and affect information sets. The way we process information, we are not anymore necessarily Bayesian. We have beliefs, and the beliefs are not determined in a very objective way. We choose our beliefs. We have some bias and eventually motivated beliefs, and this is all the work by Benabou and Tirole and all this literature that came up with understanding those interactions. And actually the interactions goes also, the arrow here goes also across individuals. What Joe is saying is that we have to add up a fourth domain in this part. On the possibility set, we have to enlarge the possibility sets to include additional resources, mental resources, worldviews, narratives. They are part of our collection of things that we can sort of pick up to make our decisions. And of course, they affect the way we view the world. We have actually preferences of objects in the world and the way we process signals coming from the world, the information set. Now, of course, when now you put everything together, this is what you get. And this is a mess. And then you say, well, what do I teach to my students? This is the quasi-rational, enculturated everything actor. And as a scientific way to look at things, it's a little bit disturbing. So generally the way to say things is that, well, you have to put more structure and to use the Occam's razor principle. Parsimony is good. One should not make more assumptions than the minimum needed. And on top of that, not only parsimony is good, but identification power, falsification is good. The easier it is to falsificate something, the better is our theory. And this is probably a principle also here that we need to put into the perspective of enlarging our views about the quasi-rational enculturated agent, okay, and its implications. Now, it's also important for policy design, because for policy design, we need to assess the relative importance of every channel, because incentives matter I think that if you're a banker and you tell them that the interest rate goes from 2% to 2.3%, that affects how he's going to go into his computer to buy and sell stocks and assets. So incentives matter. But also you have other things. Nudging might matter, or cultural tutoring. And I agree that with Joe that probably for development, nudging is not enough. You know what is this picture about? This picture basically is saying that this little fly here allowed guys at Schiphol Airport to save about 80% of the cost to clean toilets in the airport. Great. But for development, that may not be enough. So why it's not enough? It's not enough because if we think about development is about structural change. And structural change is about scaling up an aggregation of behaviors and seeing significant impacts at the level of a region, a community, a region, a state, a nation, the world. So next we need to look at how scaling up an aggregation and what is the predictive power that we can bring with those new views of the socially enculturated actor, or the quasi-rational enculturated actor, and in particular on the dynamics of social changes and societal rigidities, as Joe is pointing out. But there we face another difficulty, is that when we start to open up this Pandora's box, there's a lot of new things that come up. Externalities, number of increasing returns, social increasing returns, social multipliers. And they bring a number of exotic features, exotic, not so exotic, they might be part of the reality of the way we can interpret the world, but they bring multiple equilibria, multiple steady states. They bring also catastrophic changes, big effects of small changes sometimes, but at the same time hysteresis and persistence. And of course they bring as well, that's for what happens when we look at steady states, but also on the transition path. They bring as well the question of what is the best way to think about this change of society. Whether this is done by unpurposeful and decentralized mechanisms like evolution, or whether this is done by some design and purposeful actions of specific actors that interact strategically with other actors. And there, the role of institutions, of course, matters a lot. A last feature that seems to be very important is this tipping point that we are sort of emphasizing with those new policies and the discontinuity of regimes. Where do they come from? What causes them? When do they happen? And there, I just want to illustrate that by two examples of bad norms. Food binding in China versus female genital mutilation in Africa. Those two types of norms, we agree, they are very painful, dangerous, socially costly, bad for women, but also for society at large, if we look at additional economic aspects. Both types of norms, they are very long-standing. Food binding started in China about 1,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, and female genital mutilation probably more than 2,000 years ago. Actually, it's interesting that for food binding, the sort of narrative, and they are both associated to particular narratives. And the narrative for food binding, for instance, comes from, in the Song dynasty at the 10th century in China, there is this dancer woman, Niao Long, that wanted to seduce the emperor of the time, and then she went there and she bounded her feet in the shape of a new moon to dance on a pedestal of golden lotus of 6 feet and to impress him. And that became basically the narrative of why, and then the elite women who didn't have much to do started also to bound their feet, and then these things of course unraveled and became this terrible and dramatic practice. The case of female genital mutilation is much older and probably in Africa has many origins, whether because in the old Egyptian times, the pharaonic circumcisions, it was called, intabulation of women, or in Equatorial Africa, or in Sudan for other reasons related to the road of slaves going to the harems, or eventually to prevent women in Equatorial Africa to being raped by other tribes. But then, of course, they're unraveled, but they're all associated to a narrative that controls access to women. Whether this is about beauty and marriage, ethnic marker, chastity, fidelity, regulating fertility, mobility, and social positions of women in the society. Now, when you compare the two types of norms, one basically got very rapidly eradicated. Food bargaining basically disappeared in 80 years. At the end of the Opium War, the English basically, and as well, the defeat of the Chinese government in front of the Japanese, the Chinese were so depressed that they decided, actually, the Chinese elite decided to reform the system. And one of the reforms that they wanted to implement, the intellectuals, were actually to get rid of the food buying process. And they succeeded to do that. At the same time, the amount of resources that has been spent for eradicating female genital mutilation, still quite a significant part of Africa is touched by the problem. And there, on one side, there's a tipping point. On the other one, there's no tipping point. What explains that? There, still, open question. There are some explanations here, but I'm going to go very much quicker. Now, let me get to the last part, which is about the political economy of the QRE actor. And Joe says that narratives may make things that were not legitimate or attractive become legitimate and attractive. And I will add, and vice versa. Meaning that it goes both ways. It goes to improve things, but it goes also to deteriorate things. And the last speech of Brazilian President Bolsonaro at the ONU, the narrative on the environment basically suggests that it goes the other way, and the rise of populism as well. And there, in terms of the political economy of cultural mental models, basically the one observation I wanted to make at the end is that those new policy levers, they are based on deep cognitive dimensions, which are related to emotions, because this is the way, and consciously, we drive the way we make those things. But then if this emotion, doesn't it reducing the space for rational trade-offs and negotiations in politics? Meaning that it leads us to a view where we can get polarization. Actually, thinking in terms of policy design of new worldviews has to be thought in terms of what I will call the general equilibrium of worldviews. If you create a worldview of one sense, like political correctness, it seems that at the other hand, you have a reaction, and you have also another view that comes up as a marker, as a position, and polarization. This is related to the question of the emergence of populisms, not only in the US, in many other parts of the world, where we see certain things that will never be thought to be said by politicians, now they are openly said, and people keep on going with that. So I will stop here my comments and leave it to the floor for further discussions.
Okay, thank you very much, Thierry, for these remarks. We have more or less 15 minutes left in this session, but I think it is fair to leave further floor to Joe if he wants to react on the remarks made by Thierry, as you like, Joe.
Well, yes, let me thank you. Yeah, let me thank you very much for those very, very thoughtful and helpful comments. Maybe I'll just make two very brief comments. One of the real problems with this whole endogenous preference is welfare economics becomes really difficult. All the work on the first welfare economics is with well-defined preferences, and it is a Pandora's box, but it is the reality. I mean, we can't wish the problem away, and so in one way or another, we are going to have to deal with this issue. And in philosophy, there are a lot of discussions about the good life. Economists have sort of pushed all those discussions out of the bounds of what we can talk about. And I think you might say the good thing is it's opening up the discussion in a way of saying, what is it, the purpose of the economy? What do we mean by a good society? So it's both a Pandora's box, but also it's an opportunity. The second general remark I want to make is that one of the very uncomfortable things that all of this raises is when the World Bank did the 2015 report, there was a lot of worry that there would be charges of social engineering. And that didn't happen. And I don't know why. But the answer to those charges goes back to this broader discussion of what do we mean by a good society, what do we mean by development. We know that societies, Africa is going to have an enormous problem unless there's a demographic transition. And so it's not a question of you can say, the reality is that if the population continues to grow, there's a real problem in whatever your value system is. So trying to think, are there tools of bringing down fertility is a question in which I think there can be a broad social consensus, even with endogenous preferences. And the same thing, if you say, I think there's a broad consensus in the United States that our savings rate, our household savings, personal savings rate of zero is probably too low. And so there's a broad consensus, we want to do something to increase the savings rate. And trying to understand what you might do to increase the savings rate, you could get a broad consensus of that. It is something one has to deal with extraordinarily carefully because it does open up these problems. And maybe the third comment, all of the area about social capital, one of the always concern is that social capital has also been used negatively. Social capital in the south of the United States was what enforced Jim Crow and segregation. So it was a cooperative equilibrium of one group against another. So that issue of the negative social interactions has always been with us. And we might as well bring it out in the open and deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe, for these additional comments. Okay, we would like to ask a questions or to make comments on all what you have heard of. Okay, Andre over there. Is there a mic? Do you have a mic? Shout.
Nudging and so that we could go as far as what Thierry alluded to manipulation. We'll try to give the right norms, the right view of the world. What you say about domestic violence, of course, this is okay. But in other circumstances, it could go the wrong way. And do we have now the technology coming so that some states or powers will try to give the right norms and the right views of the world so that finally people do what the power wants.
Okay, maybe we'll collect a couple of questions before giving the floor back to Joe and Thierry. Who else? Yes, over there. Sorry, there is one. Okay, please go ahead. And then there is a question over there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture. I tend to think that changing the minds on how women can add value to the economy wouldn't change recruiters' deep preferences to see their companies to be successful, neither their strategy to hire skilled workers in order to realize these preferences. It rather seems to me that it would change the analytical framework, the information set, as you called it, by changing their beliefs on women's professional ability. Therefore, can we really say that the deep preferences change rather than saying that the strategies to realize those preferences just change depending on which tools agents think are available and what they believe to be efficient or not? Strategies which are, would be shaped by culture and emotions, etc., which might be a model which would be consistent with the Bayesian cognitive model which is used in cognitive science. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one there.
Thank you. I have an epistemological question. Economics have tried for long to move away from other social sciences through math and modelization. See left of the econs, or this article, The Superiority of Economists, which is really from Algon and Fourcade. So economists are more and more aware of their explanation power to be able to speak about the world and to design policies also. And with these new kind of approaches, for you, what will be the specificity of economics? Will some specificity of economics still exist? And I reformulate. What will be the difference between an economist and a sociologist slash historian who at some point of his life was good at math and knows how to use quantitative tools?
Okay, thank you. This is a provocative question. Yes, there is a question over there.
So thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you also think that this concept of mental models has a big role to play in the issue of climate change. It's me.
Okay, any other? Okay, maybe we'll give the floor to Joe. Maybe I would like to add an example on which ties on well with the first questions, with the two first questions. About fertility, I think this is a very, very good example. I mean, if you remember, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a kind of agreement in the international community to say that reducing fertility was a good thing. And there were programs in many developing countries about birth control, family planning, etc. Now, at some stage, maybe some 15 to 20 years ago, these disappeared in the aid community, the development aid community. Suddenly, it was not anymore authorized to promote family planning and birth control. And this basically came from the rulers in the United States, which remember the evangelists, etc., who said, no, we don't want an organization like the World Bank to advocate in favor of reducing fertility. But it is not all. In some countries, this discourse about reducing fertility was also very badly received. The argument was, oh, you want to reduce our population. You want to modify our basic living model, the life model that we have. And we don't accept that. So the point, and this echoes the point made by Thierry at the end, you have conflicting views. And if everybody is trying to nudge in one way or another, you don't know what the full result will be.
So maybe that's a good place to begin by saying, look, we are going to be engaged in battles to change people's preferences, whether we like it or not. That is the reality. So to the extent that the economists begin by assuming preferences are fixed, they're out of the game. And a lot of the big social, political battles are precisely battles about what will be the nature of our society in the future and trying to change, you might say, the preferences of the young people. So to me, this is where our big social battles go. The idea that preferences are endogenous, in the business school, we've always recognized that. Businesses spend billions of dollars to try to change people's deep preferences. When the cigarette company has an advertisement about a guy, Marlboro guy, riding on a horse, it isn't giving information to anybody, because most people in Paris or in New York are not thinking about, am I going to be riding a horse better if I smoke Marlboro? That's the only information that's being conveyed. It's about identity, it's about who they are, and it's trying to affect their deep preferences. So this battle of endogeneity of preferences, changing preferences, is what the business community is, and it's what the political battles are about. And so we ought to begin to think about how that plays out. And and what we can do, and what we should be doing. How do we think about it? So that goes back to the point I made. What do we mean by a good society? It makes it all the more important to have open, transparent democracies, so we can see what the battles are about. Because otherwise, it's done beneath the surface. We don't see it. It's done surreptitiously. So I think it highlights the importance of transparency, and in development, having more transparency about the reason we want to change fertility are if we don't hear the consequences. And I think the point you made about the political economy, making individuals within the countries make the decisions, but they need to be aware of the consequences. And this is why I don't think the distinction between rationality on the one hand and enculturated quasi-rational actor on the other isn't diametric. They're not diametrically opposed. You can let people try to understand the consequences of one choice or another, and they can think through whatever their identity, whatever their preferences are, here are going to be the consequences if you don't change, say, your fertility behavior. The question about climate change sort of illustrates the battle. When you ask my students, who do you think in the United States, what is the relationship between the level of education and support for climate change? Are more educated people on average more concerned about climate change, or more opposed to taking action about climate change? If you did a poll and you did it turns out in the United States, and it's only the United States, the more educated people are more likely to be unconcerned about climate change. And you ask, well, how can that be? Don't they believe in science? Don't you, when you go to college, don't you learn about science? Well, culture turns out to be more important than science. And the culture in the United States is, there are two cultures. There's the Republican Party that doesn't believe in education, doesn't believe in science, and doesn't believe in climate change, doesn't believe in evolution. So they are a very peculiar tribe, but they are a tribe, and they only talk to each other. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they talk mostly to each other. And so if you correct for party affiliation, the normal relationship holds. Within the Republican Party, more educated people are likely to be worried about climate change, and within the Democratic Party, more educated people. But wealthier people are more likely to be Republicans, and that effect, that tribal effect, dominates the education effect. So that shows how important culture is on something that is really important for the survival of the planet. So in a way, they see the same evidence. They read the same, no, they don't read the same newspapers, but they should be reading the same newspapers. I mean, but the IPCC report is out there for them to read. They could be reading the evidence the same way, but conformatory bias, the strength of their, you might say, their culture, their prior beliefs, are such that they don't want to hear any evidence about climate change. Now, it's beginning to change, but very, very slowly. And so it really does illustrate that these issues are really fundamental to some of the big policy questions that we face. The question, of course, about what is the role of the economist now that we've become sociologists and psychologists and political scientists. Well, one answer, which is not the one I'm going to give, but economists have always been imperialists, and they will say that we are better at all those fields than the people in those fields. But I think that's probably a wrong answer. The truth is that economics does bring certain aspects of the way you think about the world. And I think both of our talks gave illustrations of that. The natural tool that economists tend to think about, one of the tools that economists think about, are equilibrium models. A sociologist takes culture as given and asks the question, how do individuals learn from their society? How do they adapt to their society? But the economist's natural view is, well, societies are made up of individuals. So we create the society and the society creates us. It's what we would call a general equilibrium model. Not a Walrasian general equilibrium model, but it's a general equilibrium model where there's that two-way interaction. And that way of thinking is, I think, a particular aspect of economic thinking. The other one is evolutionary game theory is another natural way that economists think about things. The evolutionary dynamics is a kind of part of our toolkit, and we sort of think about how this will play out over time, that kind of dynamics. Again, sociologists are less likely to think in that way. But I think, the edges ought to be blurred. I think the edges of reality, the reality is we live in complex social environments where politics matters, social interactions matter, economics matters, and the rules of the game in the economy are determined by our politics. Our politics are affected by our social context. So there aren't any natural boundaries. And the nature of all science is that you take a big thing and then you look at a piece of that thing, but you have to put the whole thing back together again. And what I'm trying to do here a little bit is put the whole thing back together again, but then again, you're going to have to take it apart again to make progress on the identification. And then finally, on the question of whether businesses are really changing their deep preferences, or are they just changing their strategies? That reflects the difficulty of identification that Thierry focused on. And again, I don't think it's a bright line. Let me give you an example. The ideology that firms ought to maximize shareholder value was an ideology that Milton Friedman put forward in the 1970s and 80s. And most of the economics profession bought it. And the CEOs loved it because they then linked their pay to shareholder value. That made them richer, and that gave them an excuse for exploiting their workers, exploiting their customers, exploiting the community, polluting. They said, Milton Friedman said, it was a sin to worry about anything other than shareholder value maximization. that if a CEO did anything else, he was abrogating his social responsibility, because his social responsibility was to maximize shareholder value. And behind it was a theorem that was not true. Behind it was the idea that shareholder value maximization would lead to societal well-being. So that was a lens. The first welfare theorem was the lens through which they saw it. They justified that behavior. But 45 years ago, we proved that that was wrong. I wrote a paper with Sandy Grossman showing that shareholder value maximization was not welfare maximizing whenever there was not a complete set of risk markets, incomplete information, any of the conditions that we now know are absolutely necessary for the first welfare theorem. But the ideology, the culture of shareholder value maximization was so strong that it continued. The CEO of JP Morgan did not read my paper, even though I sent it to him. No, I didn't. But it didn't, these ideas got adopted in the law after our paper was written. So the ideology, you might say the culture, was extremely strong. Over the last 10 years, a number of us have been waging a campaign against this view. And, the shareholder value maximization does not maximize societal welfare. And the obvious example is climate change. Makes it a very clear example, but there were lots of other discrimination. If I can make money by discriminating, should I discriminate? And a lot of people said, no, that's not a good thing. Exploiting our workers. Walmart became, exploiting, not providing health care for their workers. There just were example after example. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote a popular book in the United States called Rewriting the Rules of American Economy, where I talked about changing the corporate governance laws and what was wrong. And it was a theme that has gotten picked up by a number of the political candidates. And then about 3 weeks ago, almost all of the CEOs of America's largest corporations said that they believe that shareholder capitalism is wrong and that there should be stakeholder capitalism. Now, they don't really believe it. But we have begun to change their mindset. The people below them, our society now understands that shareholder capitalism doesn't work, and we will be able to pass laws because they've said that shareholder capitalism doesn't work. We will be able to pass laws that say that the new corporate governance, you have to pay attention to these other ingredients. So that's an example of a change of culture that will then be embedded in law, that will then reinforce, I think, some of the societal changes. It will happen not as a result of manipulation, but because we've had a big democratic debate over many years, and I think we've convinced people that that other model isn't working. And yes, stakeholder capitalism has problems. It has ambiguous goals, but it's better than shareholder capitalism. And so that's a case where we've begun to change at least one little aspect of culture in ways that I think will make for a better economy.
I had just one element about what makes economists' reasoning different from sociologists' reasoning. And is the fact, it might look a little bit stupid, but is the fact that we are trained to think in terms of counterfactuals. We always say, okay, this is how the world works, and if the world was working in a different way, what would we get as an opposed comparison to what it is? Often other social scientists, they take the world as a given, they are inside the world, and they try to make the world evolve and change from within. While we have this view sometimes to say we compare worlds. Of course, that may look artificial from their point of view because we are still in the world, but that's a way to think in terms of giving openness to different possible worlds, and that's also an important element for reforms and other aspects that probably is not so in other social disciplines.
Okay, I think that we passed our time, so I think that we will be concluding here. I think it has been a very challenging, fascinating discussion and presentation. I thank very, very much Joe for coming today. Thank you, Thierry, for the comments, and thank you for your attention. And let me run.